Hey everybody, Jimmy Smith. It's weird getting these things daily now, isn't it? But I enjoy it. I really do like it. Anyway, so Wanderlei Silva into the UFC Hall of Fame. Before I even get started, Wanderlei, one of my favorite fighters of all time. He's one of those, and we did a thing on my SiriusXM show about the all violence team, like which guys were must-see TV. They always gave you great fights. I think my number one pick was Wanderlei Silva. The guy never had a boring fight, ever. Just even at the end of his career, he just went out there and gave it his all. And probably pound for pound the most entertaining fighter in MMA history. And that's saying a lot. I mean, that's names like, Robbie Lawler, Carlos Condit, right? Matt Brown. So some fighters that went out there and just gave everything every single time. He's one of those guys. And I often tell fighters getting into this game, back when I was coaching regularly in MMA, I said you can be entertaining or you can be a world champion. Why? I'm going to give the crowd everything. I'm going to really entertain. Those fighters typically don't get to the top of the sport. They can make money because they're super entertaining. They get a lot of, fight night bonuses and all that stuff. I'm going to entertain fighter. I leave it everything in the octagon every single time. If you look at the Mount Rushmore of MMA, which I've gone over a few times, but for me it's John Jones, Anderson Silva, GSP, Amanda Nunes. They're all professionals in terms of, I'm going to win. Crowd's booing, fine. Now, they're generally entertaining fighters, but the idea that was their priority, right? That I'm going to go out there and blood and guts, have a war every time. That wasn't on their minds. What Wanderlei is, much like Robbie Lawler, is one of the few guys who had a go for broke, give everything every time style that achieved stardom or achieved greatness. Was the number one 205-pounder in the world in his prime, arguably. I'll give some background on that in a minute. So the thing about him getting into the UFC Hall of Fame that I found kind of interesting was Wanderlei didn't do at all his best work in the UFC. At all. His best work was in Pride. He had 2 runs in the UFC, for people who don't remember. Made his debut against Vitor Belfort at UFC Brazil. UFC Brazil was not the first UFC I saw. It wasn't the first one I was exposed to. It was the first one that made me go, wow, I really need to be in this sport. I had seen previous UFCs, of course. I think the first one I saw was like UFC 4 or something like that. But it was the first one where we saw mixed martial artists with real technique who knew what they were doing. Vitor Belfort, Wanderlei Silva. Who else was on that card? I think did Frank Shamrock defend his title against John Lober, I think, on that card. Pedro Hizzo was on that. You started seeing Ebenezer Fontes Braga, Jeremy Horn. I'm going off memory. It's not in front of me right now. But it was the first one with real mixed martial artists on it, where you went, oh, man, these guys know what they're doing. A lot of previous UFCs before that looked like, street brawlers who knew a little bit of wrestling, maybe, right? So that was the first one that had a card where those guys had an impact on MMA for a few years. And Wanderlei Silva was on there against Vitor Belfort and got blown out of the water. He knocked out a guy named Tony Patera, clinched him, kneed him to death, and then fought Tito Ortiz for the light heavyweight title after Frank Shamrock vacated the title, and he lost to Tito. That was his first run in the UFC. He went 1-2. 1 win, 2 losses in his first UFC run. He was not a standout in the UFC at that time. Well, then he goes to Pride and goes on an historic, unbelievable run for about 4 years. He was just the unquestioned king of Pride. Now, this is a time you can go back and forth in Pride. You could go back and forth between Pride and the UFC, meaning he fought in Pride in between the Vitor Belfort and Tito Ortiz fights. And the Tony Patera fights in there. But that's when he was in the Pride Grand Prix. He was the alternate in that fight. People don't remember. And then when he transitioned to Pride full time, his run between the Tito Ortiz loss to the Mark Hunt loss is unbelievable. It's Todd Medina, Guy Mesker, Gilbert Yvel, which was no contest because of a groin strike, Dan Henderson, Kazushi Sakuraba, Shungo Oyama, Kazushi Sakuraba again, Alexander Otsuka, Kyoshi Tamura, Mirko Krokop. Got a draw with him in a special rules kind of kickboxing match. Kanahara, Iwasaki, Hiromitsu Kanahara, Kazushi Sakuraba, Hidehiko Yoshida, Quentin Jackson, Ikahiso Minowa, Yuki Kondo, Quentin Jackson again, loses to Mark Hunt, then defeats Yoshida by split decision. Nakamura, Kazuhiro Nakamura, loses to Hikaru Arona, beats Hikaru Arona in a rematch, beats Fujita. After that, there's the slide. But that run from 2000 to 2006 is incredible. It's just incredible. A lot of you right now listening to my voice don't know a ton of those names in Pride. You should know Dan Henderson. You should know Kazushi Sakuraba. You should know Mirko Krokop. You should know I don't know if you know Kazuyuki Fujita. But my point is, that was the best of the best in Pride. And he didn't just win. He just crushed the vast majority of those guys. Looked like they got hit by a train. When you look at Wanderlei's style, I often cite the Chute Boxe years, meaning the years that formed Wanderlei Silva. Right, when they had the Hua brothers. Most people know Shogun Hua. They don't know Murillo Ninja Hua, who's his brother. Shogun Hua, Murillo Ninja Hua, Pele, Wanderlei were kind of the core of this team. They had some other guys who were, quite exceptional. But, you also had both cyborgs, right? Chris and her husband. So it's a style that was, you went to war every single day. There are horror stories to this day of Chute Boxe and the way they trained, where they just treated every day like it was a fight. And Wanderlei is very much of that style, of go for broke. There is no round but this round. Destroy your opponent. Soccer kicks, anything. And remember, soccer kicks were legal in Pride. I remember when he fought Guy Mesker, he wasn't doing well initially. Guy was a little too slick for him. He starts unloading and hurting Guy and just headbutts him. Referee was blind to miss this, but headbutts him right in the face and just keeps going, just mauls him. Every fight was a street fight. Every fight was intensely personal. It just was what it was for Wanderlei. So Wanderlei, in another sense, is a throwback. Now it's professional. We know with all the CTE research and stuff like that how dangerous it is to spar every day. People don't do that anymore. They're very judicious about the amount of damage they take during camps. And none of that happened during Wanderlei Silva's day. So Wanderlei Silva is very much a throwback to a kind of MMA that is street fighting with, if you're lucky, MMA gloves on. He competed. Mike Van Arsdale beat him bare knuckle. Right? So he was in fights that were just savage throwbacks to a time in MMA when it was as close to a street fight as you could legally get. But I mean, completely, almost exactly the same. So that's kind of the thing about Wanderlei, is he represents an era of MMA that's gone. It's just gone. Now it's, professional athletes. It wasn't back then. It was fighters who happened to get paid to do it, in a sense. So that's incredible. Also, if you've ever interacted with Wanderlei, I have. He's a nice guy, really nice guy. The whole axe murderer thing and his savage personality and everything, that's a fight thing. He's like that bell to bell. He's not like that in real life when you meet him. He's a really nice, gracious guy. No problem stopping to give somebody a photo or sign an autograph or anything like that. So a really nice guy. His induction into the UFC Hall of Fame. Now, remember, he's in the Pioneers wing. That's a very important distinction. The Pioneers wing, when you look at the UFC itself, is the sentimental wing of the Hall of Fame, right? It's the sentimental wing. It's a lot of names that, had something to do with the kickstart of MMA. They aren't the greatest fighters of all time, simply because that era is not anywhere near as good as this era now, but it's kind of the sentimental one, the people we came up watching that we really love. In that sense, you can understand Wanderlei being in there. It's Hoist Gracie, Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn, Randy Couture, Mark Coleman, Chuck Liddell, Matt Hughes, Tito Ortiz, Pat Miletich, Boss Rutan, Big Nog, Don Fry, Maurice Smith, Kazushi Sakuraba, Matt Serra, Rich Franklin, Kevin Randleman, Jens Pulver, Anderson Silva, and now Wanderlei Silva. So when you look at that, there are guys like Matt Serra, never great in his professional career. I would say, yes, he won the title in a gigantic upset. Maurice Smith doesn't have a winning record in MMA, I don't think. I don't think he has a winning record in the UFC either. Bas Rutten only had a couple fights in the UFC. People forget that. He was UFC heavyweight champion, but very short run in the UFC. Injuries forced him out, and he had to basically retire early. So you see people that are like, okay, but they're in the pioneer ring. It's almost its own separate thing. Kazushi Sakuraba went 1-1 in the UFC against the same guy, Conan Silveira. Much like Kazushi Sakuraba, Wanderlei did his best work in Pride. When you look at his UFC career, he has a losing record in the UFC. He was not great at all in the UFC. Why? Started early, went 1-2, went to Pride, had the amazing run I just went over, went back, and was really past his prime. And not just past his prime in terms of age. One of the things I heard a lot when the UFC bought Pride is, man, Pride fighters aren't doing as well in the UFC. Like, UFC's better. Two things I will say. Number one, most Pride fighters who were standouts in Pride, Wanderlei Silva definitely among those, spent their best years in Pride. You can't have a 6-year career in Pride having the number of fights he had, and you come out the other side fresh as a daisy. It doesn't work that way. Takanori Gomi, another one, had a great run in Pride. Average in the UFC at best. He didn't have a winning record. So this idea that, those Pride fighters weren't good. No, those Pride fighters spent their whole career in Pride, going to war every single time they fought. Yeah, they're not going to come out and have a second career in the UFC that's amazing. Now, remember, Big Nog won a title in the UFC. Rampage Jackson won a title in the UFC. Shogun Rua won a title in the UFC. So there were those standouts. But the vast majority of Pride fighters spent the majority of their physical capital in Pride. They didn't have anything left when the switchover came and the UFC bought them. Number one. Number two, Pride didn't test for anything. Who was it? It was Ensign Inoue that on social media pulled out his old Pride contract, and it said, we will test you for drugs, but not PEDs. We'll test you for drugs, meaning make sure you're not coked up when you're in the ring. We will not test for PEDs. Don't worry about it. It was in the contract. So everybody was on him in Pride. Everybody. Now, someone's going to say, you don't know everybody. Oh, all right. Maybe somebody wasn't. When you see the frames of those guys, and not just the frames of, the Kevin Randlemans, but the frames when they went to the UFC are markedly different. Crow Cop is massive in Pride, comes to UFC, and he's a slimmed-down version of himself, and he wasn't the same guy. Wanderlei Silva, much bigger in Pride than he was in the UFC. Obviously, he fought in the middleweight division in the UFC. He's just... And also, I'm not getting on a moral high horse. It wasn't illegal. Right? We're not going to test for PEDs. Don't worry about it. Well, you'd be a fool not to do them if everyone else is and they don't test for them. Right? I don't like rule breakers. It wasn't a rule. It's almost like saying, you knocked a guy out with soccer kicks. Well, soccer kicks are legal in Pride. You'd be a fool not to hit somebody with them. So this idea that Pride fighters didn't do as well in the UFC, well, they didn't have all the help they had in Pride, right? They were chemically enhanced in Pride. And they weren't in the UFC because they test and commissions test and all. Even before the UFC had USADA and the testing protocol, states still tested. You couldn't just go in on anything. Ask Josh Barnett, first guy to really get popped in UFC history. So that's the interesting thing about Wanderlei getting into the UFC Hall of Fame at all is they haven't really figured out what the UFC Hall of Fame is. If it's the UFC Hall of Fame, it should be how you did in the UFC. People like Kazushi Sakuraba and Wanderlei Silva. I would argue Nate Diaz had a much better run in Strikeforce than he did in the UFC. And I made a video about the Hall of Fame that I'm going to put out closer to UFC 300 about Jim Miller and the Diaz brothers and all that stuff. If it's about how you performed in the UFC, Wanderlei doesn't belong in there. He had entertaining fights for sure, but is it about entertaining fights in the UFC? If it is, there are a lot of people that are going to go in there that, in my opinion, don't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. Hall of Fame should be about extended greatness. And in the UFC, Wanderlei didn't have that. He didn't have extended greatness in the UFC. He had really entertaining fights, but never even fought for a title in the UFC. Why? It was before Oh, I'm sorry. He fought for a title in his first run against Tito Ortiz. In that second run, he did not. His prime was spent somewhere else, making more money in Pride than he would have made in the UFC and becoming an icon in Japan. He would have been a fool not to do it. So the caveat I'll give, if he were in the modern wing, I would analyze a lot more his merit as a UFC fighter, right? Because if that's what the UFC Hall of Fame is about, Wanderlei didn't do his best work there. Him being in the Pioneer wing, you look at fighters in the Pioneer wing who, once again, don't have winning records in the UFC, but they did a lot to build the brand early. Could you throw Wanderlei into that category, having only fought 3 times in the UFC in the Pioneer years? That's an argument we can make, but the modern wing, I tend to get more into the weeds of, God, how good were they really in the UFC? Pioneer wing, I'll take those sentimental, man, I really like that guy back in the day kind of picks. I can do that. And I think Wanderlei Silva being in there, I can accept. Now, the obvious other side of it, and Dana White was asked about this because he had at one point said Wanderlei Silva is, will never get into the Hall of Fame because he had doping scandals in the UFC. Remember, he was supposed to fight Chael Sonnen in the UFC. That fell through because both guys popped. If you start, bringing in doping like you do, for example, for the Baseball Hall of Fame, right? So many sluggers who set home run records aren't in the Hall of Fame because it was during the steroid era of the 90s. Yeah, that's going to be a different issue. People are definitely going to be, and they have a right to be critical of that. I think you do. In the early days of the Pioneer wing, folks, everybody was doping back then. Everybody. As I said, Josh Barnett was caught early. He was the only guy of that era to get popped. They did not have a uniform policy. Even if there was one, it was by state, which is a joke, meaning you piss in a cup before the fight, you piss in a cup after. Any idiot can beat that test. Just cycle off in time and you're fine. So the Pioneer wing really wouldn't exist if you want to start throwing steroids in there. The Pioneer wing, just throw them almost all of them out the window. The modern wing, I think it's more relevant, definitely, for sure. Wanderlei's not in the modern wing. So I think people who are, steroids, I get that, but I think the Pioneer wing, Ken Shamrock, give me a break. Kevin Randleman, give me a break. Mark Coleman, give me a break. And I'm not going to out a bunch of guys, but we all know or strongly suspect those guys were doped at the time, which was almost a requirement that era in MMA at that level. So Wanderlei Silva in the Pioneer wing makes sense. There's just a confusion within the UFC Hall of Fame. Like, is this an MMA Hall of Fame? Is this UFC Hall of Fame? I've seen people say Zuffa, that it was Pride, Strikeforce, UFC, that the Zuffa banner. Well, you got to put Fedor in, and Fedor will never get into the UFC Hall of Fame. They'll never put Fedor in there, who never fought in the UFC. So even people who have that Zuffa umbrella, okay, Zuffa, well then Takanori Gomi should get in. He did great stuff in Pride. Wasn't great in the UFC, he did great stuff in Pride. Should he get in? You start getting kind of tiki-taka. Ricardo Arona never fought in the UFC, did great stuff in Pride. All these things. So the Zuffa banner, I see where people are going with that, but then you have to include people who had a great run of Pride, Mirko Krokop, who never had one in the UFC, or Fedor, who never even fought in the UFC. I don't think they'll ever let that guy in. So it's an interesting debate. I don't mind Wanderlei Silva in the Pioneers wing, simply because as an MMA pioneer, he's certainly one of them. Whether or not he's a pioneer in the UFC is a matter of some debate. Let me know what you think in the comments section. But congratulations, Wanderlei the Axe Murderer, in the Hall of Fame. Later.